Hello, folks, and welcome back to the Convo Debate Society for our seventh intellectual duel. I am, on the internet at least, Socrates the Younger, and I will be joined by my usual debate partner, Eric Barnard, host of the Free Speech Zone, for a scintillating discussion on whether or not democracy is the best form of government. Now, over the past few years, many commentators have offered the opinion that with the rise of populism and so-called extremist movements, obviously they've never been to Bolshevik Russia, but that's neither here nor there, evinces a lack of faith in democracy, or a sense that democracy perhaps has failed. Well, on the other hand, most of the world, or at least most of the developed world, continues to persist under democratic, or at least relatively democratic systems. So let's dive into this debate and see whether democracy really, to quote Alex Tan of TEDx Talks, delivers the goods.
Start. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us here in this debate. And Socrates, thank you again. I have to admit that I've been looking forward to debating democracy, especially with Socrates the Younger, because as people should know, Socrates the Elder hated democracy. And I just want to start out and make this very clear that there are no noble savages anywhere in the real world. Such a species only exists in the imaginations of silly people. I believe that democracy is the best form of government. Best is not defined as perfect. No system is perfect, and that is due to the fact that what lies at the core of every system is the people. People are flawed, imperfect, and that is a universal principle that discriminates against no race, religion, gender, economic class, etc. Democracy respects principles and promotes human rights. It even promotes gender and animal rights. All are equal before the law. Its people have dignity. It's the place that hundreds of thousands of people struggle to come to, and thousands more have fought and died for. Democracy has born men and women that have shaped and changed the world. No other system can claim such facts. And therefore, I will yield my time.
Start. So democracy is often held up as the best form of government. And that shouldn't be entirely surprising because we live in a developed world that is characterized primarily by by governments, at least claiming to be democratic. However, since democracy first came into existence, or at least since the first recorded democracies about 2,500 years ago, intelligent observers have been rather divided on whether it's the best form. And you can go all the way back to Aristotle for this. Now, Winston Churchill, for example, said that the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. Now, while democracy does distribute power among the people, which has a number of benefits, primarily among which is the foiling of corruption. It prevents the people in power from becoming too corrupt or too overweening. But fundamentally, democracy also has several structural problems, whether you're talking about direct democracy, very rare, or the much more common representative and constitutional democracies, which are much more common in the modern era. These all have the same structural problem, and it ultimately results in democracy being a doomed form of government. Now, the first one is one that people everywhere have probably heard of, that I barely even need to mention here, and that is the tyranny of the majority. Now, two of the most famous examples of tyranny of the majority, which, by the way, is something the founding fathers themselves were rather wary of, are in the Old South, between the end of the Civil War and the end of the Civil Rights Movement. So from about 1865 to maybe the 1970s. And people argue that it continues today, but at the very least, Jim Crow laws in the Old South were democratically popular. Among the white majority in the Old South, it was the majority of people continued to elect politicians, people like Alabama Governor George Wallace, who favored policies that discriminated against blacks. Now, one could make the argument, for example, oh, they had to specifically keep black people away from the polls with poll taxes and literacy tests and so on and so forth, but that doesn't change the fact that the blacks were still a minority of the population, and even if they had gained democratic power, would not be able to vote themselves the rights that they wanted, and that under a just system they deserved. The second example of this comes from Weimar Germany, which was a democratic system, or at least more or less a democratic system, that nonetheless managed to put Adolf Hitler in power. And this points us to the major problem with democracy. because the average voter is not informed enough or engaged enough to make the proper decisions on very complex issues like economics and social policy, and specifically the enacting of justice, inevitably democracy descends into tyranny. And not only that, it descends into the worst possible form of tyranny, which is not tyranny of the majority, by the way, it's tyranny of the person who manages to be the best demagogue. Democracy is like letting the passengers fly the plane. At the first sign of a storm, the people with the least fear of flying freak out, and they're going to turn to whoever offers safety most emphatically.
All right. Yeah, you gave two very clear examples of problems with democracy there. Taking the Weimar Republic and taking the Jim Crow South. The fact of the matter is the Weimar Republic was never a strong government. It was never a good democracy. It was very weak. It didn't have a strong army. It didn't have a good strengthhold of its economy. It was being controlled by outside forces. So you could say it was not a democracy that was able to respond adequately to the needs of all its people. And therefore it suffered a collapse, and that was due to bad economic decisions that they were ostentatiously forced into through the Treaty of Versailles. Under the Jim Crow laws, the fact that the majority was tyrannical and believed that blacks were less than whites and therefore should be forced out speaks poorly on democracy as a whole. In fact, it doesn't, because the majority was defeated. The tyranny of the majority fell and through democracy, and there was changes made to all those places. George Wallace was voted out of office eventually. Lester Maddox was thrown out. In fact, and also at times in the Jim Crow South, there were politicians who were integrating. There was Jimmy Carter in Georgia. There was Terry Sanford in North Carolina. There was Fritz Hollings in South Carolina, who integrated peacefully, I might add. But you also quote Churchill. Churchill also said that democracy is the worst form of government, but it's the best form of government that's out there, because every other system is terrible. I know I'm paraphrasing there. And I just fundamentally find that while there are flaws and there are people struggle in this system, show me the system where there is no struggle for any segment of the population at any period of time. Once again, it's the people. The people struggle, and people are flawed. And you had flawed people who believed in these horrible atrocities. And my time's up.
All right. And start. Now, I have three major points that I want to address. Two of them are in reference to Weimar Republic and the Jim Crow South, and the third one is in reference to your original statement in your opening that no other system can boast having created quite as many people who have altered the course of history in positive directions. Now, as far as Weimar Germany is concerned, even though the government was shaky at best, as are most democracies in their early days, ultimately the reason that it fell fits right in with my metaphor about the passengers on the jetliner. The real reason that Weimar Germany fell was that the people lost faith in it. The reason people lost faith in the Weimar Republic was because the threat of Bolshevism was appearing in Russia. And Lenin's government, followed shortly thereafter by Stalin's government, both had the same intention, publicly stated. We want to spread this revolution to the entire world. And people were absolutely terrified of Bolshevism. And that goes not only for Germany, it goes for France, for England, and for the United States. And so you see what happens. The Weimar Republic, which was the weakest of those governments, between Germany, France, England, and the United States, ultimately turned to a demagogue when they felt threatened. When turbulence arose, aka the Bolsheviks, they turned to Hitler. Now, in the Jim Crow South, one can make the argument that the laws ultimately fell as a result of democratic action. Though, on the other hand, one could make the argument that they did not ultimately fall as a result of democratic action, except in the few instances you've mentioned. But instead, it was as a result of federal action. In other words, people overriding democracy at the federal level that ultimately caused Jim Crow to go away. Finally, as to other forms of government that have produced people that have altered the course of history in positive ways, I would argue that the very arising of democracy itself is as a product of people who came from non-democratic governments, specifically the aristocratic system in England. As Thomas Paine argued that the British system was fundamentally not democratic, that it was run by aristocrats and the king, it nonetheless led to the arising of the United States Republic.
Yeah, my first question to you is just very simple. Compared to what? Democracy is so bad as compared to what? What else is out there is that is better than democracy? If you can give it to me.
All right, well, there are a number of different answers to that. Obviously, there are people out there who are monarchists, who are authoritarians, that sort of thing, who could marshal all sorts of arguments that their system is better than democracy, that it's less shaky than democracy, less messy than democracy, that those governments are able to get things done. But that's not likely to play well with the people watching this, so I'm not going to use that to support my argument. Instead, I'm going to go back to Aristotle, who argued that democracy, because of the ignorance of the regular people and their tendency to just vote for people who were going to give them stuff, preferred actually an aristocratic system, where people who, as he put it, had the time to pursue virtue were the best people to rule. And then finally, I would put in what I would say we actually have today. Even though we pretend that we're all democratic, what we really have is a technocratic bureaucracy, where, as for example, most congressmen don't read the bills they pass because the bills are thousands and thousands of pages long. The people who read the bills are the bureaucrats who implement them. Those are the people that really run the society and provide the bulwark against that shakiness of democracy. And so the question I want to ask you right now is that, considering that even legal protections in democracies can be voted away if enough people decide they want to, what can possibly stop a democracy degenerating into tyranny?
The thing that stops democracy from generating into tyranny is, you look at all the democratic systems that are out there, they actually don't allow for the majority to take away the rights of people. People are still protected. You see this here in the United States with the balance of powers. You see it with our federalist system. You see the states can pass a law that can be considered discriminatory or anti-woman, anti-gay, anti-whatever, and the federal government can correct that, and people can legally challenge it and stop it. And so you can sort of navigate your way through and not devolve totally into a tyranny and violence. And it's a good thing. It takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen in a year, and it may not even be the solution that people want, but it's the best solution that you can come up with. So that's the best answer I can give you. Yeah, my next question is at what cost? At what cost do we say that, okay, let's at what cost do we take Aristotle's idea and say, let's just let the people who have the luxury of being able to think of everything just run it all and make these decisions? At what cost? At what cost do we do that? These people have that luxury. How do they know what's best for you and me? How do they know what's going to work? At what cost? At what cost is that better?
Well, the question's phrased in a bit of an odd way, but I'll try and answer what I think you were asking. Now, on the one hand, you can say that, people who are in these positions, these privileged positions, this aristocratic type of person, doesn't really understand the struggles of the average working person. But we know from our own experience in the world that there are fundamental things that when people have them, they tend to live better lives. If people have enough to eat, if they have relative freedom to choose the way they want to live, and I don't mean to vote for who they want to vote for, I mean relative freedom to choose what kind of ice cream they're going to eat, what kind of car they're going to buy, what kind of insurance they want to have, the sorts of things that are everyday concerns for the everyday citizen. It's very easy to look at a piece of paper and make those decisions for people. And finally, the last part of the question here, you say at what cost? Now, I have to make it clear that I'm not specifically arguing for an aristocratic form of government or a technocratic bureaucracy, though both have advantages over democracy. My simple point is that democracy is not the best form that's out there. Now, the next thing that I want to ask you here is, given the choice between a tyrant chosen because he looks good on TV and one chosen because she managed to pass a series of bureaucratic tests and worked her way up through the system, which one is better to live under?
It's like asking me to pick between measles and a bladder infection. So the good thing about democracy is the fact that you can be given the choices between those two, but you can not vote for them. You can always say none of the above and have a vote of no confidence. Rarely happens in history, but it's out there. It's possible. And people also, they'll vote with their feet. They'll vote with their wallet. They'll vote other ways, to where I don't have to take either of these two. I don't have to take the guy who looks good, but I know he's a tyrant, and I don't have to take the woman who, in essence, paid her dues, passing all of this ridiculous bureaucratic nonsense that hasn't made life better. I don't have to make that decision. For people to settle it down and say, well, you got to pick. It's like, who said that? Who made that law? Who says I have to do that? And that's all the time I have. So my third question is just basically, what's your hard evidence of that people, if they have, enough to eat, they have enough choice. If they can have choices between paper and plastic and 32 flavors of ice cream and coach or first class or Coke or Pepsi. What's your hard evidence that, okay, well, they got that much choice and choices in all these other, minor, minuscule things, but they don't have a say-so in the foreign policy of their government. They don't have a say in the policy of their economy. They don't have a say in what laws are going to be passed and who's going to get equal justice and who's going to have access to power. What's your hard evidence to state that having choice over here but not having choice over here is beneficial and better? What's your hard evidence?
Well, I would, insofar as hard evidence, I would offer something perhaps closer to a logical argument, because I don't really want to sit here and cite. It's very difficult to cite statistics that speak to people's individual happiness. However, what I can say is this: on the one hand, there are direct, immediate needs. People who don't have enough to eat are going to be less happy than people that do have enough to eat, and one needs only look at one's own personal experience to see that that is true. And that, indeed, that is the motivation behind efforts to end world hunger. We say it's just categorically better to have enough to eat. It's categorically better to not worry about what happens if you get into a car accident. On the other hand, decisions like where specific should the tax rate be at 47% or should it be at 52%? Where exactly should the progressive rates lie? What should be the relative income levels? Those sorts of things are more abstract decisions. And saying that, oh, it's better to have those abstract decisions doesn't speak to the real everyday experience of real everyday people. And that actually touches on the final question that I want to ask you, which is this. If democracy is so valuable and is so clearly better than all other forms of government, why is it that in the United States so many people choose to stay home on Election Day?
Because people have become apathetic in their ways. People have basically settled for, like, this is all they got, so they say, why bother? People have come to believe that, you can't fight City Hall, that, the game is rigged. It's all against you. The corporations are going to do whatever they want and the unions are going to do whatever they want. And so why try? As long as I can have, my choice between chocolate and vanilla and Pepsi and Coke, and I can, still, drive, my Chrysler or my Ford, then, I don't really care. And as long as they're still going to pay me my Social Security, I'm happy. But the fact of the matter is that it doesn't take a whole bunch of people showing up on Election Day. It takes just a few people actually paying attention to actually move stuff in the right way, to turn the needle, just 5 degrees. It doesn't take that much. There have been places that have smaller populations than Stamford, Connecticut, who have actually affected great social change in the United States. It's happened. Thank goodness. I mean, that's all the time I have. All right, and start. Socrates, once again, thanks so much for putting this debate together. Thank you for participating. Once again, I really enjoyed this debate. The fact of the matter is that while democracy has its flaws, it is far better than any totalitarian system, any dictatorship, and any kind of government where the aristocrats can rule over the majority. It has its flaws. It's subject to lobbying. It's subject to potential corruption. It is subject to apathetic voters. It's subject to voters not being knowledgeable. But that's due just simply to what I alluded to in my opening statement. At the core of this system is the people. People are flawed, people are imperfect, so therefore, because they're imperfect, they are guaranteed to create an imperfect system. But it's an imperfect system that does work very well. And it's a system where people do fight to try to be a part of it, and people fight and die to see that implemented where they live. And that is a very strong argument. It's probably the best argument for democracy and why it is the best. If more people are willing to die for it or to die to try to get there, I think that shows what it means to them and what potential it truly has. And we're lucky to live in a democracy, and we can sit here and have this debate over it. And thank goodness for it. I certainly have my problems. I certainly see things that I see injustices and wrongdoing. I see them happening, but I also see wrongdoings being corrected, and I see them being answered and spoken about, and I see them being fought against. And that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And I see average voters who are apathetic at one time, but then eventually they do wake up and they do become more involved, and they do fight back, and they do become victors and not victims. And I do see people go into the political spectrum who don't care about career and do vote their conscience. And I do see people who run for principle and don't run for party. I've seen people who say, it's more important to stand on principle and to fight for democracy and to fight for what I believe in, and I wouldn't trade it for any other place. And I have to say, need I say any more? No, do I need anything else? So, and there's always going to be people who clamor and say things are horrible. They're always going to say, "Oh, it's bad. It was better at this time. It was better when this party was in charge." When Democrats are in power, Democrats say everything runs well. When Republicans are in power, Republicans say everything runs well, and they say it's bad when the other side's in charge. And that's a luxury that they have. But the fact of the matter is, the American people and other democracies around the world do have a far better way of life, and wouldn't trade for it. So that's all the time I have.
All right, my turn. Start. So democracy is overrated. But that shouldn't be that much of a statement, honestly, because democracy in the developed world is only slightly less popular than Santa Claus is among 5-year-olds. Now, democracy is popular because it looks good. It makes for good advertising. It sounds good when you talk about it. The government cares about you because the government has to care about you, because if they don't care about you, we the people are going to rise as one and vote them out of office. Right? Overthrow is built right into the system, so it's perfectly okay, and it keeps the people in power on their toes because they cannot be trusted. But as the history of propaganda, and even the history of marketing in the last 20, 30 years has shown, so propaganda maybe for the first 70 years of the 20th century, and then marketing after that when propaganda became a bad word, has shown that people are ultimately easily manipulated. Manipulated to the point that, yeah, they will go out and fight and die for what they think they're getting, when in reality, what they've been is manipulated. And the history of governments that are not democratic, that have effectively manipulated their people using that propaganda and those marketing strategies, have demonstrated the fact that people are willing to go out and die for all sorts of things, and only some of those things are actually real. And in the case of democracy, the so-called prosperity and freedom that go along with those things are ultimately phantasms. They are ultimately not real. What happens is, Democrats get into power, not Democrats with a capital D, but people who believe in democracy get into power, and everything seems like it's going okay until the first sign of trouble. When that first sign of trouble rears its head, ultimately the people turn to a strong leader who will go out and solve the problems that they need solved for them. Because, and it's completely understandable, considering human nature, they are afraid. The problem here is that democracy not only ultimately puts tyrants into power, it puts the worst possible kind of tyrants into power. Tyrants who get power because they are able to say emotional things that get people going. You can look at the recent Democratic debates a month ago if you need examples of this. The candidates competed with each other they competed to outdo each other in promising the voters free stuff and making these emotional statements that have nothing to do with running a good country, but they get people to go like this, and so those people who were the best at it, they end up in office. And you can look at the current president, Donald Trump, as well. He was excellent at doing that, and there are plenty of people out there who would make very convincing points, actually, that Donald Trump was not the best Republican candidate for president in 2016. He was just the one who got the most people up and out of their chairs. And that ultimately is not a skill that leads to good governance. Ultimately, people are going to choose a tyrant. Just, you can look back to the ancient biblical Jews who said, I forget what book of the Bible it is, but they said, look, give us a king, someone who will go out and fight our battles for us. And that is what always happens. All right, well, that was our debate for this week. I hope you found our discussion, our repartee, both enlightening and titillating in all the right proportions. Feel free to use the comment section below. In fact, we encourage you to use the comment section below to let us know who you think won and what you'd like to see us debate next. Now, you can also, if you'd like, look in the description for some of the sources that we used to construct our arguments here, as well as a link to our online presence at constitutevoice.com, where you can find some of our more interesting written material, other debates, and you can also visit meetup.com via that description, where you can find links to our live meetups, where you can come bang the table and tell someone they're destroying America. So, anyway, that's all we've got for this week. I am, on the internet, Socrates the Younger. I hope you've enjoyed everything you've seen. We look forward to seeing you next week.